Okay, hello everybody. I think I know most of you, but I'm Kathy. I'm lecturer at Bristol, and in my day job, I lecture at uni. And one of the things I've managed to do, I was just saying to Charlie, is to work citizens' assemblies in my team, which I'm quite pleased about. Because as I'm going to share with you in a minute, I think it's an absolutely transformative idea in terms of how we do democracy. And as you'll probably be aware, it's one of XR's 3 demands. So act now, tell the truth, and decide together. It did used to be called something a lot more opaque. I can't remember what it was. What was the third demand called? It was something. Was it just citizens' assemblies? Nobody was like, sorry, what does that mean? So decide together, actually, it's a little bit clearer. But it's still one of those things which I think is often quite a challenge for us to talk about on the street or to communicate really effectively. So I use it in my teaching in relation to fracking. So we talk about fracking and about some of the social science around that, and I use it as an example of how we can create public conversations about things that are important to communities. And citizens' assemblies work at a very local level, or a national level, or indeed at an international level. And there's lots of examples, some of which I'll touch on, of where it's being used already. So the bit that I do, as somebody who's, so my field, but my background is actually in science. So I was once upon a time a scientist, I became a teacher, but went to a science centre and then I'd come back into academia, but as a social scientist. So I just said to Charlie, I'm only partially assimilated as a social scientist, it still feels a bit weird. It's like, what am I doing here? Talking about these things. Because it's quite a different thing to science. But science communication is all about how we communicate this stuff to non-specialist audiences. And truthfully, well, ironically, if science was just about truth, if it's simply this kind of truth-seeking missile, science would never be controversial. But what we know about science is firstly truth, as science defines it, can change over time. But also, there are always areas of controversy around it, some to do with science fact controversies. Do we have enough information? How do we interpret that information? Some of it to do with science-based controversies about, what do we do with this stuff that we know? How do we apply it? What are the implications of that science from a social or an economic or practical point of view? So there's lots of ethics often comes into science as well, doesn't it? So there's always ways in which science courts controversy or has to engage with controversy. I would say that climate science has moved from being a science fact controversy to being a science-based controversy, because you have to try quite hard now in the general population to find people who are flat-out climate deniers. But there's a lot of discussion and debate, obviously, about what we do with that science, how much we trust it, what the implications of that knowledge are for how we live and how society needs to be, how it needs to function. And I put down there very, small letters at the bottom. Obviously, science requires decisions to be made, but governance also requires decisions to be made. And there aren't necessarily obvious decisions that flow from science knowledge or science fact about what we should do with it, because obviously there's different things that people who govern our country, who run the country, they have to consider a variety of different factors. So think about the COVID rollout, or COVID vaccine and lockdown and all that stuff. It wasn't simply about an epidemiological consideration, it was about education, it was about the economy, it was all of that stuff that they have to factor in. So it's never as straightforward as it might appear. But I think I put in very small letters, science and democracy share the same DNA, by which I mean that the way that science works and the way that democracy works, in principle, best case scenario, is that what both of them show us is that authority can be challenged. Democracy at its best is obviously different from autocracy, different from dictatorship. We know that we can change governments if we need to. That's the theory, isn't it? That's what how we like to think it works. And the same with science. Science responds to new information. So both of them are able to change. It's not a doctrine which is set in stone from forever and ever. So I have got, actually I'm going to get to a little quiz bit in a minute. So this is what I think is quite interesting. This is some data that was published, just a sort of first release of a bigger data set across 63 countries and more than, 70,000 people, which shows that actually people would like scientists to be more involved in decision making, which I thought was quite interesting, quite encouraging in a way. Whether or not scientists are always the right people to make decisions about everything is entirely a moot point. There's probably lots of exciting things that scientists like to do, like cloning people maybe. I often thought if they were allowed to do it, they'd probably clone people all over the shop. But actually, there's all sorts of really good bodies that regulate that sort of activity. AI is another good example, isn't it? Some science needs regulating, but I think there's a recognition that maybe scientists aren't as involved in that policy making as they could be. The relationship between scientists having good ideas and it becoming policy, in a governmental sense, is, scientists are very, very small players in that whole thing. It's difficult to get that stuff picked up and taken on board because there's all sorts of strong forces that push in the opposite direction. So I have a little quiz for you now. If you want a bit of paper, well, actually, the quiz. This is quite a quick bit, but every year Ipsos Mori, of the pollsters fame, they publish a thing called the Veracity Index, and they ask people, how much do you trust this person to tell you the truth? And they list a whole load of different professions, and I want you to guess for me what you think the 5 least trusted professions are.
Estate agents.
Correct, it's one of them. Yeah, very good. They're always in the bottom 5. A politician, everybody who's an estate agent, they get such a bad rap, don't they?
Politicians.
Politicians, yeah.
Lawyers.
Lawyers, no, actually no. Journalists, yeah, journalists. Should we have a look? I can't remember what the other one is. So, here we go. Politicians generally. Advertising executives. That's really terrible, isn't it? And that's gone down. Can you see it was 16% last year and it's 12% this year. 16 and 12%, it's gone to 10 and 9, which actually is really depressing, isn't it? The extent of how little we trust our elected representatives and the fact that there's been a real erosion of trust in public office, which I think is probably a Boris Johnson effect. Regardless of what you think about his politics, I think he's left a really bad stain on how people feel about because his dishonesty was so transparent, wasn't it? So yeah, what about the other end? What about the 6 most trusted professions?
Teacher.
Teacher, he said the teacher. Teachers, yes. Doctors. Doctors and nurses.
Churches.
Oh, do you say that? They're quite high, actually. Yes. So I have to they introduced a couple of new categories this year, which have bumped scientists off the top 5. So I was a bit grieved about that. But anyway, here we are. Nurses, medics always come in the top 5. Airline pilots. I feel like you have to trust your pilot, don't you? When you get on a plane. That would be really bad if you didn't. Librarians, doctors, engineers. Okay, so what do you think? What is the quality that this is measuring? So they're asking people if they trust them, but why is it? What have those people at the bottom got in common? What have the people at the top got in common? What's self-interest? Do you think? Something about their intentions, I think, about their authenticity of them, about their lives.
Their lives, whether they live or die.
How do you mean? What, the top end?
Yes.
I don't think librarians are in that category, are they? But I think that, I don't know what you think, for me there's something about the genuineness of the intent. It's like, librarians just want you to borrow books. That's what they want. Please read some books, they're wonderful. It's like, they care, it's a kind of a service-minded mentality. Yeah.
All of those things are very specialist. Like if you want to be a pilot, you have to really focus and learn how to fly a plane. So you're not really thinking about how to cheat people. You're learning how to fly a plane.
That's interesting.
Engineers and doctors, they're all very specialist and you have to
Where is that not?
focus.
Not so much?
You have, like if you're an engineer, you're trying to build a machine or something, or design a machine, that somehow doesn't get to the public. You're not interfacing with the public so much in order to...
Although I guess nurses will be, won't they? But yeah, so maybe there is something about that, something about specialism. Yeah, Andrew?
The 5 least trusted professions often have a lot to benefit from if they tell us.
Yeah, so this is what Hilary was saying about self-interest. Yeah, that they stand to gain from it. Richard?
I was just going to say, most of these professions do need a certain amount of training, whereas you look at the other list, and I mean, anybody can be an estate agent or a politician or
Okay. Yeah, Ben?
Apart from the librarian, isn't it? The other four, we sort of have to, we put our trust in them.
Yes.
I mean, whether we should or not, no matter, but, you know, we put our trust in them.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose, yeah, we're required to trust them, aren't we? Yeah, in order for them to perform their function. Yeah, so hang on to that thought. I'm going to move on actually, but hang on to that because I think it's relevant to how democracy works. And actually, what a sad thing it is, you know, that we're asking the people who we are entrusting with making the biggest and most significant decisions about our life are actually the people we trust least. And what is that about? So, you know, there's something strangely broken here. That's the whole survey. It's worth looking up, actually. But we've got the ordinary man or woman in the street. You might as well ask them. No, never mind politicians. What do they think we should do about all of these things? And then scientists are there. So, yeah, so it's interesting. But they probably, yeah, as I say, they publish it each year, so you can have a look. This is the most recent one. So think about how we make decisions about science. It's not just about science, but a lot of climate, you know, climate stuff stems from science. It's kind of a science-based view. And the various things we can look at in terms of how we make decisions. So we can use authority, we can use majority, we can use unanimity, we can use consensus. And these all have, you know, pros and cons. We don't, well, sometimes we use authority actually. We do cede responsibility for making important decisions to knowledgeable bodies. I wrote down some examples of those. So I mentioned actually, I think earlier on, maybe the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, you know, Ofsted, the Atomic Energy Authority, the Bank of England, you know, regardless of how we might feel about these bodies, they're regarded as a group of specialists who have specialist knowledge. So that's kind of decision-making by authority. Unanimity is quite a high bar, isn't it? But then you think about juries, and normally they aim for a unanimous verdict for most cases when in court. It's only under rare circumstances that they go with a majority verdict. So there are cases where unanimity is applied. Consensus is an interesting one. Consensus doesn't mean that everybody has to agree. It means they have to be happy with the decision. It's a decision that people can live with. And consensus works best when people agree stuff together. So that's what we're going to get to in terms of citizens' assemblies. That's really the power of them. So in these countries, you will know we have a system of democracy, often described as the least worst system. And we also have representative democracy, so forgive the sort of politics 101, but just so we're all on the same page, you probably know all of this already. We have 650 constituencies in the country. This is the current distribution coloured by political party. It looks very blue, obviously, but partly that's, I mean, it is because obviously we have a Conservative majority at the moment, but Conservatives have more rural constituencies, and because they're geographically, they contain 650 people, it always looks bluer on the map, regardless of even if we have a Labour government. So one constituency per MP, and nominally, MPs are supposed to represent the interests of all their constituents. In reality, that's probably quite hard. I mean, it's hard for them, I would think, actually. If you're a government minister in a government of whatever colour, you have to, you know, follow a party line, regardless of what your constituents might feel. So that's, in reality, that's quite hard. We also have a first-past-the-post system, which means the person who polls the most votes within a constituency wins. So the example you can see here, the blue party wins with 25 votes, even though 75% of the people in that constituency didn't actually vote for them at all. So there's an issue in terms of representation, and that is, of course, what proportional representation seeks to address. So having a parliament which is more accurately composed of the numbers of votes that each party holds. It's quite difficult when you've got a constituency-based approach, but there are ways around it. Lots of different systems of PR. Citizens' assemblies are not the same as PR, but there are some kind of overlapping concerns. So this gets us to issue number 1, which is that Parliament doesn't reflect the voting patterns of the country as a whole. So it's not representative in that sense, in terms of the votes that have literally been cast. So this is the quiz bit. How representative are our representatives? So we elect these representatives, we send them to Parliament for us, so there's 650 people there. As a body, how representative are they of the population of the UK?
No.
So, pens poised, please, people. If you have a pen, if you need a pen and a piece of paper, here they are. Okay, question number 1. You're basically guessing percentages.
Actually, I think it's the way pen distribution.
Oh, pens,
Right. The left-hand side.
You can't without a pen. I don't understand. I never leave home without a pen. It's one of my greatest fears. Is it? Are you the same? I might be somewhere. Oh, I have to write them down. Okay, question number 1. Of the 650 MPs we have at the moment, what percentage of them, oh actually no, this is a number, not a percentage, how many of them are openly gay? Or LGBTQI? Out of 650, how many of them are gay? Yes. Well, so we can only base this, actually, because they're not required to provide that information. We're only basing it on interviews and public statements. Of 650, how many are gay?
Open.
Yeah. How many are trans? Trans. Okay, we're going to move to percentages now. Sorry for the inconsistency. What percentage are women? And what percentage are minority ethnic? Back to numbers now. What number are consider themselves disabled? Or say that they are disabled? Obviously, disability is quite a broad thing. Okay? At 650. How many of them say that they are disabled? Not how many are disabled. We don't know. Yeah, how many? What percentage are public school and independent school educated? It's always very confusing when I have American students who think public schools are the free ones. I'm somehow trying to explain. So independent, what percentage were educated at independent schools? Yes.
As in they pay.
The ones where you have to pay, yeah. What percentage went to university? Okay, that's the end of the quiz. Well, I'll give the answers now. So, people who are MPs that are openly gay, how many out of 650? One. Really lowballing me down. Somewhere between 1 and 100. It's 45.
45.
Yes. And again, it's about 3% of the population, and that's based on census data. So this is the only absolutely, the kind of solid data that we have for this stuff is based on the 2021 census. And because it's a family reported thing, so everybody feels in it's a household, there is a view that it might be underreported. Because it's 3% based on the census, yeah.
And if it's
45 out of 650, what's the percentage there? Somebody reckon? More than 3%, yeah. Okay, how many MPs are trans? One, yes, Deb's on fire tonight. One, and it's Jamie Wallace, who's Conservative MP for Bridgend in Wales, currently, and he made a statement, actually what he said was, I'm trans, or to be more accurate, I want to be, and that was in March 22. So that challenged some of my assumptions. I thought it's not going to be a Conservative MP, so it just goes to show, isn't it? Shows me anyway. What percentage are women?
30%?
32. 220 out of 650 MPs. Actually, slightly more than 30%. What percentage are minority ethnic? 10. I didn't say that the percentage of women in the population is just slightly over half. So quite significantly underrepresented when you consider how long our parliament's been around. Minority ethnic, it's about 14% of the UK population. It varies hugely by party. So 63 of the minority ethnic MPs are in the Labour Party, 63% are in the Labour Party, 20% of Labour MPs are minority ethnic, only 6% Conservative MPs, although quite a few of them are in the Cabinet, which creates a very misleading impression, which they do make sorry, this has become quite political, hasn't it? But, sorry about that. 6% Conservative, 18% Liberal Democrat, so there's a lot of variation between parties. Okay, what number of MPs are disabled? Say they're disabled.
7.
Who says 6? 7. 6. It's 6 people. 6 people out of 650 against the UK population of 24%. It's massively out of step. Okay, public school educated. How many MPs? What percentage? 98%. Play properly for that.
69.
Public school educated, independent school educated, what percentage of all MPs? Sorry. Sorry, you said? 70, it's actually 27. But again, 27% are public school educated, 80% of Conservative MPs are. That's actually, sorry, that's incorrect. 80% of those are Conservative MPs.
Yeah, right.
Of Conservative MPs, 44% of Conservatives are public school educated, 19% of Labour, I was quite surprised about that, but against a national average of 7%. So again, quite a lot more than is...
How many is it? 7%?
Well, quite, yeah. And, yeah. So, then at last one, what percentage of MPs are university educated? Not far off, 87%. Of which 22% went to Oxbridge, and a third on top of that went to Russell Group universities. The national average of graduates is only 20%. Because don't forget, there's a lot of people, it was only when Blair came in that suddenly the percentage of people going to university increased massively. Before that, it was only about 5 or 10%. So actually, you know, casting a look around this room, a lot of us will be in that generation where, you know, it's quite a small proportion still that were going to university routinely. What this all means, of course, and I'm sure you realise, is that in our elected house, representatives there are far more likely to be male, white, middle class, university educated, and southern and independent school educated than the majority of the population as a whole. And if you look at some of those things, and you know, leaving aside that women are only 30% or so, 24% of people in the country consider themselves disabled, as opposed to 6 people in the House of Parliament. You know, where are their voices when decisions get made? Because there's a real issue. It's not just about proportional representation, it's about who we've got in that house and who they speak for. And if you have no experience, you have no lived experience with this stuff, it's a struggle to understand what that feels like and what that means. So we've got some quite big issues. So this is issue number 2, is elected representatives do not reflect the population as a whole. So here's our map again of the UK, but there are other ways in terms of how you slice the population where we can see that there's not good representation. One of the issues we know with general elections is that young people are always underrepresented. If only young people voted at the last general election, it would look like that. So a Labour majority of 438. Do you want to see the other one? If only people over 65 could vote. Look like that. So there are huge demographic differences in terms of voting patterns within the population. And young people, actually, we didn't talk about the age of people in Parliament. You know, this is much likely a much older group of people. for kind of, I guess,
We
maybe some
work for
obvious.
the Liberal Democrats, I'd really love to know them.
Well, so where are the Liberal
I
Democrats?
said,
you say?
yeah, I
That's what everybody's asking about.
which age group votes for the Liberal Democrat? I really need to know that.
Some people there? People there?
Not in Bristol, but.
You used to have a few more in the southwest, didn't you?
Yeah.
So here's a nice quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The people of England deceive themselves when they fancy they are free. They are so, in fact, only during the election of members of Parliament. As soon as they are elected, they are again in chains. So we have this moment, don't we? And then we live with the consequences for the next however many years it is. And God spots, we've really seen some consequences over the last few years, haven't we? And in terms of political discourse, I describe democracy as the least bad system. There's lots that's wrong with it, isn't there? For me personally, I think, it's hard to see what a perfect alternative would be, but we know that it's adversarial. There's very sort of like a kind of quasi-legal way of debating stuff, which aren't really debates at all. And when I used to run a sixth form, I used to quite often have debates with students. And in the end, I decided that it didn't feel like a very healthy thing to do. We used to have a debate about lots of stuff like, should torture be legal? That sort of thing. And actually, you get groups of students to come up and advocate for a particular point of view, and very often what the voting of the people who are watching turns on is who they like the best. Or, who the coolest kids are, who can even, best case scenario, who can marshal their evidence in the most effective way, who's best at putting a point of view across, not really engaging with the issues at all. And I did it a few times and had a whole, 400 sixth formers vote in favour of bringing back torture. I thought, something's wrong here. This is what, I hate to cook the books and stuff, but I really was not looking for that outcome. So, as a way of it's very binary, it's very divisive, and what it doesn't do is allow people to engage with what the issues are. Because people aren't engaging to learn or to understand, they're engaging to win. And that's what we see in Parliament all the time. People just trying to win an argument. And that doesn't get us where we need to be. It's also, going back to what we were saying just now, it's very majoritarian, because that's the way it's set up. The majority party makes the rules, the biggest represented group in the chamber makes the rules, so that is going to have an influence. We've got five-year terms of Parliament. That means that by the time we get, now we're well into thinking about elections, but 3 years in, parties are thinking, actually, what do I need to do to make sure I can get elected next time? They're not really thinking about what do we need in 50 years' time. So it's a polarising setup. It doesn't bring people together, it doesn't breed good understanding. And it's heuristic. What I mean by that is that we make decisions not on a careful evaluation of the evidence, we make gut decisions. And it's not just it's not just our elected representatives, we all do it. But politicians are not immune from it either, and it gets into all kinds of difficulty. And in terms of polarisation, it's really easy to see how it happens, tiny incremental steps. So imagine two people who, during COVID, remember at the start of COVID when the vaccine first came out, they didn't know it was safe for people who were pregnant. So there was a lot of debate about, oh, I'm pregnant, should I have the vaccine, should I not? Imagine two friends who, one of them decides, I think I'm going to wait, because science doesn't really seem settled, I'm not quite sure, I'm just going to pause, see what happens. And the other one was, well, actually, no, I'm definitely going to do it, because that's what my health visitor said I should do. They'd made very, well-reasoned decisions, but each of those people then becomes exposed to slightly different conversations. The person who's had the vaccine needs to feel that's the right thing to do, and so they will be very open to all sorts of confirmation bias, all sorts of conversations, stuff on social media, conversations with friends that reinforce that decision, and so will the other person. And so little by little, they can make small incremental steps. Suddenly they end up a long way apart from one another. And bringing those two ends of the spectrum back together is then far more challenging. And obviously social media doesn't help us with this at all, but lots of our media generally has a big role to play in this sort of thing. So that's an issue that politics doesn't help us with. And I think some of you might have seen this slide before when I was talking about Malcolm X a long time ago now. But there is a problem with the way that we think. So thinking back to this heuristic thinking, we like to think that we think with our heads, that we look at all the evidence and we make decisions that way. Unfortunately, the truth is it's anything but. So we trust people who are like us, which is why the messenger is so critically important to any information that we're receiving. It matters who is saying it. But actually, probably slightly more worrying and significantly, we rely on intuition and gut instinct. So we make decisions based on partial evidence, and that's what we stick with. And sometimes it's very difficult to get people to change their minds about stuff. So no amount of effective, face-to-face fact imparting is going to really shift the dial when people have made up their minds about stuff. Because if they don't trust you, and they've already decided, then you're lost. So we like to think that we're all terribly, evidential in our decision making, but actually we're not. I'm not talking about people that we might talk to, I'm talking about us in this room. We all do it. So we need methods to move us away from that kind of faulty thinking, that sort of lazy thinking. And this is a little shout out here. Somebody, a wonderful person who died this week called Daniel Kahneman. I don't know if any of you know of him or have heard of him. He's a cognitive psychologist, he was. He died at 90 years old and he wrote an amazing book called Thinking Fast and Slow. He did lots of research back in the 1970s with his then colleague Amos Tversky. And they had this whole field that they explored about the way that we make decisions. Because the view at the time was that we're kind of rational decision makers. That we look at the evidence, we think about it, we weigh up the pros and cons, we come up with the best outcome. What they demonstrated was that nothing of the sort happens at all. And he, in this book, which is very readable and very worth looking at, he said that we have two ways of thinking. System one, which is what we do most of the time, when you're just on autopilot, you're making decisions about stuff without really even thinking about it. And there's very good evolutionary reasons why we do that, because otherwise the world would be thoroughly exhausting. Some things we have to take for granted and just be on autopilot. But when you need to think about stuff, that's when you need your system 2 to kick in, and we don't do that very often. We only do it when we have to, when we're made to, when we're presented with a situation which is so challenging that, when you're sort of thinking, oh God, I can feel my brain working now. That's your system 2 kicking in. But thinking is hard and our brains are lazy. Somebody should be driving. So this is how I like to think about it. So Kurt is the system 1 thinker. He's just all about the hunches, isn't he? Whether they make sense or not, he's just like, I know what we should do. And then he's like, yeah, James, that sounds amazing. Why do you think that? I don't know, I've just got a feeling. No, that's him. Spock is the system 2 thinker. So we need to be more Spock. Everybody needs to be more Spock. We need to slow down our thinking in order to just think about, what are the implications of this? What do we know? What do other people think? But it's so unusual for us to actually have an opportunity to do that in a really meaningful way. So one of the other things that Carmen came up with, this idea of what you see is all there is, Wysiati. And this is again, going back to us making decisions based on partial information. We don't wait till we've got the whole picture. We've created whole scenarios, whole stories in our minds about people's motivations, about who we trust and who we don't, and why, based on what's right in front of us. We don't go digging for more information. And because those stories that we then create in our brains are so difficult to challenge, we don't, they're other people, it doesn't matter, the facts that people present you with are not going to make any difference. And they may very well be wrong. So in other words, issue number 3, politics, because of the way it works, is really not set up to enable us to make wise decisions on long-term or complex issues. So, where do we go from there? How can we, as I say, all of these things, these people, I don't know if you've seen them, Kurzgesagt, the most amazing little videos, they're so fantastic. Watch the one about what happens if the nuclear bomb drops on a city. It's very exciting and a bit alarming. But anyway, they do lots of really interesting things about philosophy and science and politics and all sorts of stuff. But we need to engage with that complexity and the ambiguity, and goodness knows science is about ambiguity. Science isn't about truth and certainty, it's about bounding uncertainty, and we have to embrace that. And one of the challenges that we have in our hyper-polarised society now is very divisive certainty. You know, people think that they know, and we go out looking for information that confirms what we think we know. So we need to slow that down and listen to each other, listen to other people's points of view. Enter citizens' assemblies. But what we're aiming to do with this, of course, is to shift the Overton window. So in terms of climate science, we know at the moment, you know, what changes in society people are going to vote for and what might be required. So I looked up where the Overton window came from the other day, because I thought it was probably a Mr. Overton, which in fact it is. Joseph Overton. But anyway, so it describes, you know, what people currently find acceptable. So the Overton window is broadly speaking is set by so sometimes natural events, you know, societal events, very much by the media. So the media is very instrumental in setting the Overton window. Politicians respond to it. We might like to think that our leaders were sort of, you know, these amazing orators and communicators, that they would lead us in a better direction. Actually, all they're doing really is scanning the horizon to see what people will vote for. You know, I'm being a bit cynical here. I know that I don't mean that's true of all of them, but broadly speaking, they're not going to make the case for something that they think is dead in the water from an electoral point of view. And for really things which are really challenging, like big long-term issues like climate change, why would they do that? You know, if it's going to be electoral suicide for them, why on earth would they touch it? So we need, you know, citizens' assemblies can give them the information they need to be able to push these things through with some confidence. So it's about deliberation. It's about deliberation, not just dialogue, not just debate, but about making hard decisions together. And Ellen Landemore, who's written a lot about this, she's a political scientist at Yale, said it isn't representation that's a problem, it's about how those representatives are chosen. So, enter citizens' assemblies. So citizens' assemblies are a representative group of citizens selected at random from the population to learn about, deliberate upon and make recommendations in relation to a particular issue or set of issues. So they meet over a fixed period of time, they make recommendations and then they're disbanded. There have been quite a lot in Ireland, a few in Scotland and all over the world, and they're one of, as we said at the beginning, one of Exile's 3 demands about a way of taking those wicked problems, as they're sometimes described, are just too difficult for governments to realistically get to grips with, and put them in the hands of people who don't have a vested interest in a particular outcome, and give them the time, give them the tools to actually think about it together. So, just put there, not the same as proportional representation, not the same as direct democracy. So I think you highlighted one, Nigel, didn't you? One in Taiwan.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting. It's in the newsletter actually, so it's worth looking at. So they've introduced a sort of digital engagement with political ideas. Not the same, it's not a citizens' assembly, because it's not representative. So we'll come on to that now. I mean, it's one of the biggest strengths of citizens' assemblies. Of course, we know this. I mean, this is based on sort of ancient Greek, the idea of representation. They had a very interesting view of representation, but you know, that's what they thought that's what they were doing at the time. Not so good if you were a woman or a slave, or you know, or not an Athenian actually. I think you didn't get a look in, but we are already familiar with it from juries. You know, here are people, 12 people who are non-experts, who we put this immense responsibility in their hands of making decisions about people's freedom, and they're guided and supported in that decision-making process. So it's kind of familiar in some arenas, but we don't necessarily think about it in those terms. And when we speak to people about citizens' assemblies, quite often they say, well, how will people know? You know, I just don't want a bunch of strangers making up their minds about something that affects us. But, you know, I'd much rather have those people that we don't trust at all. Don't say that, actually, but, you know, that's a sort of the question, the hanging question. And in Exile, we also use things called people's assemblies. And this causes some confusion, so I thought it'd be good to just kind of just flag that. A people's assembly is something which is just a way for a group of people to make decisions together, collectively. So within XR, we do that with radical inclusivity, so making sure that everybody is heard, everybody gets to contribute, and trust and active listening. So there's a kind of a set process to go through, but we could have a People's Assembly here. The difference is that it's not representative of any particular given population, and that's the key difference between that and a Citizens Assembly. So we have in the past had quite a lot of People's Assemblies at meetings, and it's a way of sort of sharing opinions, sharing thoughts, and sometimes making decisions. So back to Citizens Assemblies. How are people selected? They're selected by a thing called sortition. And sortition is a stratified semi-random sampling. And what that means is that of all of the people that you could select, you've got all your volunteers, people who have said, I'd like to take part, you know what the demographic makeup of that population is. You know how many people, how many men and women you've got, how many, depending on what you're looking at, how many disabled people, how many people of colour. You make sure that from your potential volunteers you select so that your Citizens Assembly accurately reflects the population that is making that decision, that decision affects. So that might be Bristol, it might be a regional thing, it might be a national thing. And you would have to have really good data on what the proportion of those different groups were, and you compose your Citizens Assembly accordingly. So Ellen Landemore, who's, as I say, who's written a lot about this, recommends that they are between 150 and 1,000 people. 1,000 is quite a lot. So you don't want a small number, because with a very small number it's quite hard to make them representative. So the bigger it is, the easier it is to get that accurate representation. They've been used in loads of different countries. One of the challenges is that when people set them up, they're very rarely, in fact I don't know of any cases where they have a pre-agreed that they will be bound by, the government or local authorities will be bound by the decisions that are made. Because obviously politicians are a bit nervous about that sort of thing. So they don't commit in advance to being bound by that. I know in Bristol there was some debate about that, wasn't there? I think looking at Steve there before it started. But we do know that some of our political parties, we've got Just Hoyle, who we mentioned as Assemble earlier on, Citizens XR, obviously advocate for Citizens Assemblies, but the Green Party and Labour, we'll see what happens there, have also said that they would include this if they come to power. But it depends, I guess, what sort of issues they put before a Citizens Assembly, or what kind of scale that they're talking about doing that. But encouraging science, and I think it's gaining traction. There does seem to be a lot of conversation about it now, which is really encouraging. I'm not going to play this to you now, but I'll share the slides afterwards. It's an absolutely lovely video about the first Scottish Citizens Assembly. It is so heartwarming, it brings a little tear to my eye every time I watch it, because it's very, very Scottish, apart from anything else, which I love. But listening to the people who took part in it, who come from all different walks of life, the depth of the experience that they had, and the trust and connection that they felt to their country, to each other, to the democratic process is really amazing to hear, actually. And just in that one sort of 10-minute video, it really conveys a lot about what difference these things can make. So there's 3 phases to a Citizens Assembly. So it normally happens over a period of several weekends normally. There's a learning phase. There might be some pre-learning, because learning is important to this. It's not the same as everybody having a voting machine. It's like, what do we all think about immigration? Everybody vote now. Because you get, it's about having informed decisions and discussions. So the first bit is you learn. The second bit is the listening phase, and that assembly they can invite specialists, experts, people with lived experience, campaign groups, whoever they decide they want to hear from to inform their decision. They can bring those people in and decide to hear from them as part of their learning and the listening phase. And the last bit is where they make decisions together, they discuss and they debate. It's all very expertly facilitated. It's an absolutely essential part of it. There's an organisation called Involve who do this for a living, and they are the experts in making sure that everybody gets to speak, everybody's voice is heard, and it's a very structured process. It's not just a bunch of people in a room arguing about stuff. So the conclusion is that they will then make recommendations for whatever the local authority or the country is, and that will be, as it stands, at the moment considered and maybe will go forward into policy. But there have been some really notable wins here. So you might already know that same-sex marriage in Ireland and abortion rights in Ireland came from a citizens' assembly, not because the government said before we will abide by whatever you say, but because it showed them what the strength of public opinion was, and they recognised that it wasn't going to be a massive vote loser. So it gave them the confidence to actually include that in their manifesto in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have done. So it really can move things on. I think one of the challenges is having citizens' assemblies where things don't happen as a result, because that, again, can sort of slightly erode people's confidence in the process. So I think, it's like any sort of fake consultation, isn't it? You ask people's opinion, and they tell you, and then you ignore them. I think that can't be good in the long term. So very quickly, there's just, people often say, what if people don't know enough? This is a very interesting document. As I say, you can have a look if you want to. I can't remember what it's called. Evidence versus Democracy. So, and it sets out how we can use these sort of mini publics for all these sorts of reasons, and the different types of evidence that the mini public, that the Citizens' Assembly might draw on. So Bristol had a Citizens' Assembly. We were going to ask Paul. We did ask Paula O'Rourke actually. He was very instrumental in setting it up. She was a Green Party. She's still a Green Party councillor. Yeah. She was instrumental in setting it up. It's just published its kind of final report. I'd love to hear Paula's thoughts on how it was and what she thought about it. It was quite small, and when I was reading the summary report, it was saying something that I thought actually is they asked quite a lot of questions. So it was trying to do quite a lot of work within one citizens' assembly. So they already had quite a small number, which means it's hard to get that really good, solid representation. They also then, I think on the next slide, it's about how they selected people. That's just quite interesting. So they had 12,000, they sent out 12,000 letters randomly, explaining what it was about. 700 people went on to apply. And so of that pool of 700, they then selected their 60, so they knew they had the right representation. And they used data, like indices of multiple of deprivation for Bristol to make sure they had the people that they needed. So this was the structure of it. And again, I mean, it's great that we did it, actually. But because we had 3 different issues and they split people into 3 different strands, they ended up with 20 people in each strand, which again isn't really enough, I would argue. And then they only had 2 weekends to discuss quite absolutely, humongous issues for to get your head around and really make something sensible of in the amount of time in the space of 2 weekends. And then they came together and made some conclusions. I mean, it's not to say it's without value. But I think the important thing is to keep going with this stuff. Yeah.
Wasn't some of it over Zoom because of the pandemic?
I think it was all over Zoom in the end. Yeah, and that's probably was quite challenging as well, I would imagine. So I think, let's go to. Yeah, there's a couple of other examples of citizens' assemblies that have. So not just about climate change. One's about Brexit. One about funding of adult social care, so you can use it for a whole variety of different things where you want to give people the opportunity to be part of the democratic process. And so in terms of what it means for us, I think in XR, I think, as I said, it's quite a difficult thing, I think, for us to sometimes to convey on the street or in the form of an action or something else. I mean, there's been lots that has been done, so don't get me wrong, people have done lots of work, but these massive decisions that we know are going to have to come at some time are going to need, big decisions need big buy-in. And we're not going to get that big buy-in unless we have a decision-making process that people can trust, where the decisions are made by people who we trust. Going back to what we were saying earlier on, people trust people who are like them, people who they can relate to. So we need that trust, we need the representation, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. We need everybody to be there, to be part of that conversation. And getting together to learn and to understand rather than to win. And Citizens Assemblies offers all of that. And for me personally, I think the more that we can do as a group, and as XR generally, to advocate for them, to really put them front and centre and proudly, you know, spread the message about that's actually what we believe in and this is what we think is the way forward. Because we're not saying what we think the solutions are, we're saying we need everybody to decide. Everybody's got to be part of this process, not just us. And so it's from the Electoral Reform Society, that was good timing.